Welcome to The Power Within, the podcast that uncovers the real stories and strategies behind leadership and personal growth. I'm Keith Power, and in each episode, I sit down with inspiring individuals who faced challenges, built resilience, and discovered what it takes to lead with impact. Through their journeys, we'll explore the mindsets and tools that drive meaningful success. If you're ready to grow, lead, and unlock your true potential, you're in the right place. My guest today, Sebastian Bates, founder of the Warrior Academy, helping children build inner strength, discipline, and responsibility, using martial arts not as the destination, but as the vehicle. If leadership starts in the boardroom, we've already waited too long. When we talk about leadership, we often think about adults under pressure, big roles, big decisions, and the weight that comes with them. However, character, confidence, and how we learn to face challenges shape leadership long before anyone earns a title. My guest today works right at that foundation. Sebastian Bates, welcome to The Power Within.
Thank you so much for having me. Great to be here.
I was surprised when I read this, but you experienced bullying as a child.
Yep.
And martial arts became a turning point. What did it give you back then?
So for me, it's only when you look back and you join up the dots, right? Why do we do what we do? And, when I think about the impact of bullying in my life, it's probably the reason why I do what I do with the Warrior Academy and the Bates Foundation, right? I've literally spent my life, my adult life, helping young people overcome bullying and helping parents mentor their kids through that transition. So bullying was kind of fundamental to my life growing up. It led me down this path.
So what do you now realize it was really teaching you, the martial arts at that time?
When I look at bullying, it's one of those things where the harsh reality of bullying is that we can't prevent it from happening entirely, right?
Yeah.
If you look at some of the schools out there, they'll say they are a bully-free school, which is just
no
nonsense.
Such thing.
You can't. Exactly. And so bullying is the ugly part of the human condition, right? It's where young people are learning about socializing and so on. But one of the harsh truths about bullying, which I've written about in the book Not a Victim, essentially with a lot of bullying, we actually attract the bullies into our lives from the areas in our life that we don't feel empowered in. So if you don't feel physically empowered, you're more likely to attract physical bullying. If you don't love a certain trait or characteristic about yourself, you're more likely to be insulted or upset by someone picking on you for that, and therefore invite bullying into your life. And so martial arts, and the key to all of this for me was why martial arts is such a good vehicle for this, is because it's essentially a holistic system to grow a young person into an adult, a healthy adult, right? And it's almost like extreme self-development, because you might feel part of a community, but you're working on yourself, and it builds that emotional intelligence, that leadership, that resilience, which helps young people transition through bullying.
The martial arts is way beyond the physical. It's more the emotional and the intellectual development you're talking about then.
Yeah, absolutely. So, doing martial arts growing up taught me so much more than just kicking and punching, right? It's so easy for people to think, you sign up to a sport, what do you get out of it? You kick a ball around on a pitch, or you throw a basketball, but you're also learning traits while you do that. The beauty about martial arts is the reality is you've got this moral compass guiding a young person, which other sports don't have. And so not only that, but it's almost got this disciple-like nature where you do have a strong aspirational role model that guides students, guides young people for several years on that transition through bullying, through adolescence, into adulthood. So it's remarkable in the way that it uniquely challenges and grows young people from a self-development point of view, way beyond the kicking and punching.
You talked about a book. What's the book about, and is it available now?
Yeah, so the book is called Not a Victim. I've written 2 books. The first book I wrote is called The Warrior Method. I wrote that in 2017. That essentially guides parents through the 4-step warrior method that we've got, that we've now used to work with over 50,000 families around the world. It's called the Warrior Method. It's all around developing your child's character, giving them what we call a black belt character. So that is our 4-step methodology. After that, we've got the Not a Victim book, which is the anti-bullying book I wrote. One of the things that I really realized is over the years, 15 years working with so many kids around the world, I noticed so many parents coming to me because their kids were going through bullying, and parents just felt totally lost. They felt this element of guilt or shame that they couldn't help their child, they couldn't prevent the bullying, and they didn't know what to do. And, oftentimes these parents would come to me after a class or something, and I'd be looking at them and I'd see the same hopelessness and helplessness that I could see in my own parents' eyes when I was going through bullying. And I wanted to help those parents with that specifically. And so I wrote the book, Not a Victim. It's essentially an emergency survival guide for parents to mentor their kids through bullying, right? So this book has everything you would ever need to know about mentoring a child through bullying in the entire book. However, if you flick to the middle of the book, there are the 6 steps that we use, the 6 Ps we call it, to mentor a child through bullying very, very quickly. And for a lot of parents, they can flick to the middle, and within 2 weeks, their kids, transitioning out of bullying or making big steps towards that.
So looking back, do you think that early experience with bullying shaped how seriously you now take character and responsibility in children?
Character and responsibility. I think that we place a massive emphasis on the academics of young people. We push them into school. We put pressure on them for grades and academics throughout their life, often before they're even ready for it. But we don't have that same emphasis on soft skill development, which is essentially character development, right? And for me, I realized early on that if you want to give your child good grades, develop their character, right? And their grades will magically start getting better. If you want to improve your child's character, grades and improving their academics won't necessarily have that carryover. And so fundamentally, what I really believe is that we don't need better educated leaders managing, businesses, charities, communities, countries. We need leaders with a better character, a stronger moral compass. We need leaders with more emotional intelligence, more awareness, more courage. And all of this comes down to character development. So I think one of the greatest ways I can help this planet is by bringing character development to the foreground, making that more of an emphasis than academics, and encouraging parents to invest more in their child's soft skill development than just their academics.
Excellent. And my daughter is 11 in Singapore. This is now the critical year where all the pressure piles on. They do what's called a PSLE, primary school leaving exam, but it's an examination over a 5 or 6 week period. And we're concerned more about not what grades she might achieve, but her mental ability and her resilience. So I might be reading your first book myself very soon.
Yeah. There's some great things you can do. I mean, for any parents listening to this who have got kids with, going through exams, there are so many little things you can do to build their habits before they get to that stage. One of the greatest things you can do is, a daily habit routine that reduces the stress that they may feel. I don't think that the solution is removing pressure from young people. I think that we bubble wrap kids too much. I think actually we need to put more emphasis on giving them the coping mechanisms, the coping skills, the habits, the routines to regulate their emotional system, to regulate their nervous system, right? To feel more grounded and to be able to breathe through pressure. And so there's so much you can do, in that situation, if you're listening to this, to actually prepare your child for it.
So you're currently in Dubai, in the UAE. You've got your books. You do your physical lessons and classes, but do you have anything else in the Warrior Academy that people around the world can tap into as well? Yeah,
so with the Warrior Academy, we've got a team of about 100 now. We teach about 3,000 children every week in the UAE and the UK. So we're the biggest martial arts academy in the Middle East. We've got 4 full-time academies here. And then alongside that, we've got the Bates Foundation charity, which takes the concept of the Warrior Academy, which is primarily working with fairly affluent families in the Middle East, and provides that same course, that same life-changing black belt journey program into the harshest environments on the planet with vulnerable children. So I started this 3 years ago with 30 children in a homeless shelter in the largest or the third largest slum in Africa, just outside of Nairobi. And it's now grown to sponsoring over 10,000 kids every single week.
Wow.
Alongside that, we give out 100,000 meals every month. So we essentially give out over 1 million meals a year while taking 10,000 kids through this life-changing program. And it's my kind of vision for the Warrior Academy has shifted so much because of that. If you look at what we're doing around the world, we're in 7 to 10 countries teaching 13,000 kids every week. But now we are influencing the mindset of young children growing up with abundance and so much opportunity here in Dubai and UAE with how they can make a global impact. And so we give them direct connection to kids in the slums of Africa, Nepal, Sri Lanka, India. So in terms of how you can be involved with the Warrior Academy, I do a lot of stuff for parents online. I provide a lot of content, make a lot of videos, do a lot of courses online for parents if they're interested in that. If you want to be involved with the charity side of things, that's what we're up to. We've got a Patreon program where I take entrepreneurs, specifically entrepreneurs who are looking for more adventure and fulfillment in their life, on a 3-year journey. And that 3-year journey takes them around the world. They come with me on a scholarship tour. So I've literally just come back from one a couple of months ago with a group of about 20 entrepreneurs where we went to the biggest slum in Africa and we gave out hundreds of thousands of meals. We visited about 7 different scholarship sites, so homeless shelters, orphanages, slum schools. And we did the largest martial arts display on the planet for 2025, which is quite amazing. We did it over 1,000 kids in a slum, all with Warrior Academy uniforms on. And we filmed it as part of a documentary, which we're pitching to Netflix. So you can kind of see that documentary and see what we're up to. All really, really exciting. But the powerful thing there is, what are we actually doing for entrepreneurs? Because, you know, so many entrepreneurs, and there might be a lot of entrepreneurs listening to this, and this might relate. They build a successful business. They feel like they want to give back. And so they start donating to charities. But then what happens is that donation just feels like a bit of a tick in the box. They don't feel any real connection. And they don't really know where the money goes. So there's no transparency or connection and no really feeling of fulfillment by doing that. And so I've kind of built what I wanted for myself and what I realized after speaking to so many entrepreneurs that they need in their life, which is adventure, excitement, fulfillment, and true impact. So that's what we're doing. That's kind of how you can work with the Warrior Academy, how you can work with me, and how you can work with the charity.
So the Power Within, just found out yesterday, we're across 34 countries. So how can a parent who wants to get involved or a child reach out to you then, Sebastian?
So if you're across 34 countries and you're interested in, you know, the Warrior Method or the Not a Victim system or developing your child's character, give them a black belt character, any of the stuff I've been talking about in this podcast, the best thing to do is to find me on Instagram, I would say, or even YouTube. So seb.bates on Instagram, or you can just type in Seb Bates on YouTube and I'll pop up, and probably this podcast will pop up. But you should see me quite easily then, if you're on this and you're watching this now. But that's where I put all my content. I do, you know, multiple videos every single week that's really dives into some of the topics that parents often struggle with understanding or grasping. And I've got a real no fluff approach. I feel like there's so much theory and fluff out there that I try and deliver short, sharp, impactful and relatable advice for parents that they can use based on all the experience I've had working with thousands of kids.
Let's rewind a little bit now. At 24 years old, a base jumping accident leaves you paralysed, with doctors saying at that time you'll never walk again. In that moment, what was the hardest truth you had to face?
There were several moments throughout that journey where it'd be very easy just to lose all hope. I was a professional fighter. I'd spent 1.5 years, 2 years training and fighting in Thailand in some of the biggest stadiums there. I was an extreme sports athlete, 500 wingsuit base jumps around the world. I would spend all my spare time hiking up mountains, jumping off them. My life was very physical. My resting heart rate was like 35.
Wow.
You know, so it just super athletic all the time, busy doing stuff. And then the universe forced me to stop and slow down.
Yeah.
And really, I realized that the route I was going, I probably wouldn't be alive another year. When I went through the accident, for the next 12 months, I was basically lying horizontal. I couldn't really move. The tendons blew off my left leg, blew off my left ankle. Both feet broke, both ankles broke, both legs broke. Miraculously, I'd stayed alive. I stayed conscious enough to be able to get some support from an ambulance. The air ambulance couldn't come, so I had to wait 4 hours to get any morphine. I was taken back to the hospital. Doctors looked at the x-rays, told me I'd never walk again. So 24 years old, going from super athletic, I can do anything, the world can't stop me, to you're never going to be able to do anything again. I think the first thing that went through my mind is complete denial. You know, they can't be right. It's not true. You know, whatever they say. And I suppose that denial helps you up until a certain point. Yeah. You know, for the first kind of 6 to 8 months, that denial probably pulled me through and pulled me out of some very dark places. For those 12 months where, I couldn't really walk at all, and if I did start to walk, it was with a limp, I had 15 of my closest friends die. And this is the harsh reality of extreme sports. You're kind of in this cult where the kind of sport you're in is more important than life itself. And that might sound so bizarre, but essentially, the only way you can justify throwing your body off a cliff is to say, this is the most important thing in my life. And so, for a lot of people, they're willing to give their life for a sport like that, pushing forward human flight and the experience they feel. And so for 12 months, I was kind of stuck just watching this go on around me. And, I was filled with survivor's guilt. It was a really difficult time. Probably one of the lowest points of that was being in hospital. After about a year, I was referred to the pain clinic. And the pain clinic, for anyone who's been, it's normally people in their kind of 70s who go to the pain clinic where they teach you how to live with pain for the rest of your life. And they basically say to you, all the physios and chiropractors or whatever, and the specialists there say to you, look, you're never going to improve. This is how life's going to be. Get used to it. You now need to be practical. This is what life's going to be like. So, the steps now are how to live with it with lots of pain medication every day. That was probably one of the lowest points for me because, up until that point, I'd say quite positive. I still couldn't feel my left foot because all the nerves had basically died in the left foot. So when I went back to see the surgeon, my mum drove me in because I couldn't drive. I went back to see him. And when she left the room, I spoke to the surgeon who had done the surgery. And I said to him, I basically begged him to remove my foot. I asked him to remove the foot because I couldn't feel it. I thought that if I could, remove that foot, at least I'd be able to walk. Maybe they'd be able to, put a prosthetic foot on or something. 25 years old I was then. That's what I asked him. And he put his arm on my shoulder and he said to me something I'll never forget. He said to me, Sebastian, now is not the time to give up. The reality of that moment is it's amazing how throughout this period, medical professionals had been so pessimistic on everything that I was going through because they want to cover their backs, right?
Yeah.
Up to that point, it was like that was the most positive thing someone had said to me. And then over the next year, I started to rebuild myself. I used Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I couldn't stand up and fight, but I had all this energy and I wanted to compete again. And so I used Jiu-Jitsu to do that.
So your ground game improved no end.
Yeah. So I had already done Jiu-Jitsu for a few years before then, but it started to become a bit of an obsession. And so I was training Jiu-Jitsu 2 hours every day. I had to start from the floor. I couldn't do trips. There were so many things I couldn't do. But then I got really good at the things that I could do because I had all this energy to put into the stuff that I could do, without being on my feet. And before long, I was competing all over the UK nationally, which is amazing. I could use my body again, right? And so, yeah, it was quite a journey going through all of that.
Let's rewind a little to your surgeon, because there's a key point there. For anyone who's watching this, who's a leader of people in any way, shape or form, the surgeon, they did something different. They reached out and put their hand on you as they spoke and delivered those words. And when you're communicating with people, if you're communicating with them face to face, if it's something you really want to resonate, to put your hand on their arm, their shoulder, make a physical touch, mentally prepares the recipient to take that in. And you probably haven't thought of that before, but that moment, that surgeon, either consciously or unconsciously, reached out, touched, then spoke words you haven't heard for a year. And that's probably why that has resonated so strongly with you as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, if you want to make something land, and really carry weight, that's just such a great technique to use, isn't it, as a leader? So yeah, 100% that would have made a massive impact.
Maybe we don't want to stray too much into politics, but if you look at the expert at that, Bill Clinton, you watch when he engaged with people, he always put his hand on it. He put his hand in other places, that's another story. But he connected. And that surgeon connected with you, right? I didn't want to let that lesson go by this all.
No, so, it's a great little hidden lesson there.
Many people experience trauma, perhaps not as extreme as yours, and they either shut down or become bitter. What choice did you make consciously or unconsciously that changed your trajectory?
I had a business while all of this was going on, and I had about 200 or 300 students in the Warrior Academy. The reality was, I suddenly realized I had all this responsibility to look after all these kids that I was training. I had an assistant who covered me for a few months. which was great because I managed to have this accident just before the summer holiday when everyone was breaking up and we had less classes on. But a few months later, I realized I had to get to these classes, and so for about a year, I taught martial arts on crutches. Parents of their kids would drop their kids off, open the door for the instructor, and I would then walk in. And I think one of the hardest things was telling them that I'll be fine soon, because ultimately these parents are investing their time and energy into a class where they want their kids to learn how to do martial arts, right? And I, on one hand, I felt convinced that I would heal, and on the other hand, I had doctors telling me this would be my life forever. Yeah. And then in the middle somewhere was trying to run a business so that I could afford to live. The beautiful thing about that is it kind of forced me to run classes without being super physical, but actually connecting with these kids through soft skill development, through developing their leadership, through developing their emotional intelligence. And I think that, if you had to force an instructor to teach on crutches for a year, they have to become incredibly resourceful and a very good mentor without just copy my techniques.
Of course.
And so that in some way that kind of helped me quite a bit. But I think what stopped me from becoming bitter and resentful is I had a purpose, right? Every day I had to wake up and do something. I met my wife 3 weeks before this accident. And so, and now we've been together 10 years and we've got 3 kids.
She's a keeper.
I know. And you can imagine this, right? So she met this extreme sports athlete, professional fighter. 3 weeks later, this guy is in hospital, told to never walk again. She's there through all of the loss I experienced of my friends, the loss of my body, sometimes the loss of my mindset, the peaks and troughs that you would experience in that over several years. And so it's kind of remarkable how that relationship kind of sustained that in the early days. Now, if you ask her, because people ask her this all the time, why did you stay with him? What made you stay with him? And she said it was brilliant because finally he was staying in one place and she could actually go on dates with him.
Always look on the bright side. So rewind slightly. You jumped forward back into martial arts, etc. But relearning how to walk must have felt humbling. What did that process teach you about patience, about discipline, and about identity? Because you'd identified prior to that as the all-action man, right? So how did that humbling experience, how did you process that?
So I think one of the first things when you go through a life-changing, life-altering accident is a lot of the stuff that you could have done before completely goes. And so I kind of later found out that I had ADHD, and it's been impacting my life throughout my life and now my kids' lives and so on. And a big part of why I did base jumping in the first place was down to ADHD and risk tolerance and all this sort of stuff, which is another podcast entirely. But the reality was I was using my body a lot to regulate my nervous system, right? So you imagine I had all this energy. I was using my body to let it out. And one of the hardest things about having ADHD is if you can't use your body, what that then does to your mind, right? You've got this kind of Ferrari engine in your head, which you can't really use you can't really use your body to calm yourself down. And so learning how to regulate my own nervous system, control my emotions while laying completely flat and still for months and not being able to do much exercise for years, certainly a lot less than I wanted to and that I was used to, was exactly as you said, one of the most humbling, challenging experiences, but also one of the most poignant transitions of character that you can go through. One of the things you do have to be quite careful of is this concept of identity. I totally agree with you. When that shift in identity, it's very easy to go from my identity as a extreme sports athlete, base jumper, professional fighter, to I'm now injured. And then as you're going through that transition from denial to recovery, you then you identify yourself with, I'm a victim of this accident, right? And so the new identity can be even worse. Sure. And this is what I think started to happen to me. I had been through so much pain, and for the last 8 years, every day I'd wake up and it would take me about an hour to be able to walk without a limp. And so I would walk 3,000 steps maximum per day. I would measure my steps to make sure I didn't go over 3,000, whereas other people would measure them to make sure they do 10,000, right?
Yes.
And that was really difficult. I would lift weights all the time, but I couldn't walk much without being in loads of pain. And so over time, you start to identify with someone who can't do that. And then that changes your thought process around the decisions you make, where you go, what you do. Until around 3 years ago, I was suffering without realizing from PTSD from this accident and the series of deaths that I had from friends afterwards, right? So survivor's guilt and PTSD from the event. And so my body was storing all this tension. My body was storing all this pain from the experience and this identity of a victim of this experience. And so what I discovered was working with a hypnotherapist was completely life-changing for me. Did a bunch of hypnotherapy. And during this process, which was, quite intense, I had to say goodbye to each of those friends individually. And I realized that a lot of my body was holding on to all this guilt, the survivor's guilt, because I was taking more risk than most of them who didn't make it. And so I didn't feel like I deserved to be alive while all that was going on. And gradually this tension and stress and guilt started leaving my body. At the same time, I worked with a really great personal trainer who pushed me more and more to do more steps. And within a 2 to 3 month period, I went from never doing more than 2,000 or 3,000 steps without being in agony to doing 5,000, 10,000, 15,000, 20. I was doing 40,000 steps a day for several years. And, this was coming from a place of never walking to now being obsessed with it, right? So I removed a chair from my office, just had a walking pad. I'd walk 6+ hours every day. That became my new identity, right? It was like this journey from one identity to the next. And now I'm challenging that again, and running's always been out, but now I'm doing an Ironman and triathlons and all this sort of stuff. So it's amazing how your identity shifts when the right mentors or leaders come into your life.
If you don't mind, I'd like to explore a little bit. You've mentioned a couple of times about the loss of a number of friends in a relatively short period of time. Do you mind me asking what were the circumstances of some of those losses?
Yeah, of course. When you look at skydiving, you jump out of a plane, you pull your parachute, you've got a backup parachute if it doesn't work. When you look at base jumping, you're jumping off a cliff or a bridge or an antenna or a fixed object, right? When you do wingsuit base jumping, the idea originally was to use the wingsuit to get further away from the object you've just jumped off. But with all base jumping, you've only got one parachute. Terrain or proximity flying with wingsuiting is when you might have seen it on YouTube where they kind of follow the cliffs along.
Yeah, I've seen.
And so you take this concept of wingsuit base jumping, which is actually relatively safe because you're getting further away from the cliff, to now going at faster speeds, a different glide ratio, and as close to the cliff as possible. And so a lot of these accidents happen from collision with the cliff, from people going too close, parachutes not opening, sometimes people hiking to dangerous spots and falling off the side of, sheer drops, parachute malfunctions, landings that are too hard, all this sort of stuff, basically. So it's normally impact after the jump.
But those numbers you said about around 15, that's a lot.
Yeah.
That is a lot.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot. I'd be at the pub with someone, having a few drinks, jumping with them for a couple of weeks, and then, literally the next week, you'd hear the news.
That's crazy.
And the community is very, very tight.
Yeah, crazy.
And so before long, this just becomes normal. If you're a soldier on the front line, right, and you're in a very, very high risk situation, and conflict is every single day. After a while, you don't become numb to it, but you do kind of get used to this is the reality of the job that you're in or the whatever you're doing, right? And I think it's no different to this. Obviously, this is it's voluntary. People are doing it because they want to do it, but it's something that over time it doesn't seem abnormal. It's obviously incredibly sad and depressing, and the experienced base jumpers actually expect it. And so after they meet young new base jumpers, let's say you meet 10 new base jumpers, you're pretty certain 3 or 4 of them aren't going to make it over the next year.
That is
crazy
odds.
It's scary, but that's the reality, right? You see in the film Point Break, it's this sort of lifestyle. In fact, a couple of my mates are actually the stunt doubles in that, but it's this sort of lifestyle that the guys have, and it attracts such interesting people from all over the world that you'd never expect to do it. But at the same time, you might be experiencing all that beauty, but such is the universe, all that pain comes with it, right?
I wonder if any studies have been done on how many base jumpers are actually ADHD sufferers as well.
Yeah.
I suspect it's higher than the average population.
Totally. And I would say the same thing about entrepreneurs. I think that a lot of the time, you need a very different risk profile to most people. Why would you give up a job and take so much financial risk and liability to put all of your ideas and effort into something which may not work and everyone tells you won't work and there's no certainty that's going to work in the first place. And that's why, when I meet entrepreneurs, such a high percentage of them have ADHD. Yep. And I think when you do have ADHD, it's quite hard to find people you can relate to because sometimes your energy is quite intimidating and people don't know what to do with it.
Yeah, you wear people out, literally.
Yeah, but when I'm with a group of entrepreneurs who are quite, type A and going for it and really pushing themselves, the percentage of those ADHD is much higher and it's much easier for me to find my people. It was the same thing with base jumping. Any sport or activity or business or whatever, vocation, profession that requires a higher tolerance of risk, without a doubt, attracts more people with ADHD.
But also is a little bit, as you alluded to earlier, like a self-medicating thing. And I saw my ADHD, even by 30, I channeled it as a superpower, quite literally. And I wouldn't have achieved most of what I did without being ADHD, frankly.
ADHD can be debilitating for some people, right? Yeah, and there are lots of levels to it.
Yeah.
But for a lot of people, it's like a superpower. And I can have sickening work ethic. I can forget to eat and sleep and just focus on one project for 10, 12 hours without even stopping, right? And that can be really great. If you've got a project, you're kicking down the doors and trying to make something work and you're being super creative and really into something. But then I can try and learn something and it just won't sink in because I'm not interested enough.
Yeah.
And I've got a son who's just been diagnosed with ADHD. And it's funny now because now I know I've got it. And I'm like, it's hereditary. Okay, so he's got it. I can now help him with all the things that, I wish I kind of had extra support with.
You couldn't cope with at the time.
Yeah, exactly.
When I'm older than you, of course, they didn't have Ritalin. So they gave me a drug called phenobarbital, which is a barbiturate. It was basically to just numb me and slow me down.
Yeah.
So it's great that the world has come on so far that they're identifying ADHD much earlier. There's a lot more knowledge out there and experience. And as you said, there's a lot of proof now coming out that it can be hereditary. So being a parent of an ADHD, when you are ADHD yourself, gives your son a bit of a head start. Let's go back to, we touched earlier again about this, you didn't just return walking, you went back to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and competed nationally. What did stepping back onto the mat represent psychologically for you, not physically?
Purpose and, being useful, using my body for something. If we're not looking at this from a physical point of view, we're looking from a mental point of view, then it's all to do with feeling useful and being able to apply myself and feeling competitive. When you go from professional fighter and like extreme sports athlete to nothing, just the idea of rolling with someone on the mats and, having some sort of equality on the mats, because when you're on the ground, it was fair game, right? Standing up, doing Muay Thai would have been a different story. I wouldn't be able to throw a kick and balance on the other leg. But Jiu-Jitsu was great. And it was the great equalizer for me. It was like, now I can use my skills, my energy, my discipline for something useful. Yeah. And it gave me purpose. I suppose it gave me control back in my life after so much had been stripped away from it.
And then that control and that purpose, at what point did you realize that your journey wasn't just about your personal resilience, but instead about building something for others, especially children, with your work?
I mean, that's evolved as it's gone on, right? So initially, when I first started the Warrior Academy, it was I'd come back at sort of 20 years old from a Thai boxing camp, and I really wanted to work with a Thai boxing club, and so I took over a rundown inner city gym. And it was mostly 16 to 19-year-old young men who were going through lots of difficult transitions. Lots of them were, living fairly rough lives. They were, drugs, alcohol, social abuse, domestic violence, all this sort of stuff. Some of them were sleeping rough. They would come into the dojo, which was the top floor of this kind of rundown gym. They would kick their shoes off, come in, and probably start a fight with the nearest person in there. And it was just this room filled with testosterone, right? Yeah. And so I was taking over from this group of lads. They needed to see a positive male role model, and they had never seen one.
Yeah. Yeah.
The aspirational role models they had weren't healthy. And so when they saw me, I bowed as I entered. I always called them sir. I always shook their hand. I parked my shoes. I didn't ask them to do any of this, right? And so what I would do is I would do all those things. They would see me do it just at 20 years old. And then I realized that I had to meet them where they're at. So this is long before the base jumping accident. So I had to meet them where they're at. This is the start of the Warrior Academy. So I would do really tough training, incredibly tough fitness, incredibly tough sparring, and I'd be in the trenches with them through all of that to earn their respect. So you imagine 90 minutes into these sessions, they're looking at me as their leader, as their aspirational role model, as someone they want to copy because he can handle all this. He's one of the best at sparring here. He's tough. He's got strong fitness. And those are qualities that they respected. But then they would see me bow, show respect, call each other sir, park the shoes, all this sort of stuff. And before long, they started copying the things I did more than the things I said. And within a year, and this is just like parenting, right? Within a year, I wasn't forcing them to do anything, but they were just copying simply by being around me while I was showing the example. And before long, these guys were coming in. They were parking their shoes neatly, bowing as they entered, shaking hands, not drinking, not doing drugs. They weren't sleeping rough. They didn't have all the domestic issues they had. They were able to control themselves and avoid danger, avoid confrontation when they left the dojo. And we had 15 national champions from that one group.
How did that make you feel?
It made me feel like I'd just figured out what I wanted to do. And I realized that if I had only worked with them when they were younger, 4 or 5 or 6 years old, if I could plant those seeds of a black belt character from a young age, where would they be? And that was the turning point, right? That was the turning point where I said, right, I need to work with younger kids. And so very quickly I pivoted and started working with primary school kids. And within a year, we had 300 primary school kids in our academy. And that's been our focus now. For the last 15 years, we've been working specifically with young kids. Our kind of typical age group is 7 to 9-year-olds, that crucial age before preteen. But we have kids now joining us from 2 or 3 years old right up until they're 18, 19. And now a lot of the kids who've been with us 8 years now work with the Warrior Academy, right? Anyone who gets a black belt with us, we guarantee a job because we know they've been through the process.
For parents listening again, can you just walk us through the Warrior Method in simple terms?
Yeah, sure. So there's 4 parts to the Warrior Method. Community, inspire, challenge, lead. And it's kind of like a circle, right? So if you imagine it, community, inspire, challenge, lead. Now, the first thing that we do when it comes to the Warrior Method is we analyze your child's 3 C's. So if I was going to simplify character development into just 3 simple things, it'd be developing your child's confidence, their conduct, and their concentration. So when you develop all 3 C's to a high level, you develop what we call a black belt character. So the first thing we do is we analyze your child's breakthrough area, and you can go to breakthrougharea.com and you can have that free analysis yourself. We'll give you a personalized PDF report. The next thing we do is we then take your child and you through this 4-step methodology where we make sure that they've got a safe, supportive community that they trust and they feel a part of. Then we inspire them, right? And when you want to inspire a child, you inspire them through role models and through language. The way you speak to a child literally paints a picture of what they'll become. So there is a huge step here in inspiring, giving them something to believe in. The next step is to challenge. So we look at the comfort zone and we make sure we push children out of their comfort zone into the high performance zone, but before the hyper anxiety stage. So there's this middle ground where you push a child into something that feels uncomfortable, but it's within their abilities. And that makes sure that it's a repeatable process. So we give them a daily habit routine, a goal-setting cadence, which lasts 8 years. We break down the 8-year journey into literally daily steps for them. And so if they do those daily steps, they achieve it. And finally, the final stage there is to lead. We teach kids, as soon as they enroll with us, leadership skills. So they'll be coming to the front of the class, teaching a technique with their instructor, copying what the instructor says, while in front of 10 other kids. Even at the age of 4 or 5, they'll be doing this. And so they become very good at public speaking. They become very good at giving orders or demands across to a large group. They become very good at controlling themselves under pressure. And obviously when they're working with groups individually as well, it develops their emotional intelligence. And so that then feeds back into community. And so you've got this kind of flywheel effect of, community, inspire, challenge, lead. And that's basically how it all works.
It sounds simple, but there's a lot of thought gone into that and a lot of structure behind it. And as you say, you've literally trained thousands and perfected that. I need to follow up as well. And where you were talking about this leadership early and presenting at a young age, both my daughters, we sent them to Montessori schools. Very similar principles involved, where as you progress in age, you look after the younger ones, you take responsibility, you go up, you present, etc. So both my girls don't lack confidence or resilience, and inculcated in them through the Montessori method. I would say yours is just a hyper-advanced version of that. So many parents want to protect their children from struggle, right? As you said earlier, wrap them in cotton wool a little bit. How do you help parents to understand the difference between protection and preparation?
Great question. I think that parenting is this challenging balance of protection and empowerment. And so it's really easy as a parent to do one too much or the other not enough or whatever. Typically that comes from the teamwork you've got. If you're lucky enough to be two parents raising a child, then you're in this situation where you typically have one parent focusing more on empowerment, the other focusing more on protection. The kind of generic example of that is the overprotective mum and the dad who's always trying to push their child. And so the reality is you tend to find this balance naturally as a partnership. Sometimes you need to let the other partner do their thing and allow them to actually push the child and encourage that. But there is a point at which it goes too far, right? There's a point at which protecting goes too far. Yeah. There's a point at which empowerment goes too far. Yeah. So two very, very quick examples of that. Protection going too far would be jumping in too soon, right? So rescuing your child too soon, helicopter parenting, pandering to your child's needs all the time, especially as they get older. The other side of this would be over-empowerment, right? Where the focus is on pushing your child so hard into something which they don't like, they can't do, and they realize that whenever they try something, they will fail and they don't want to repeat it. And so the key there is if you're trying to empower your child, you need to be encouraging them to understand that trying new things is just a normal part of life. Yeah. Struggling with things and experiencing failure is just a normal part of life. It's what we do. And so there's so many things that we do with parents to help them achieve that. You know, a lot of it is having this kind of focus on mantras at home, right? So one of the things that I say to my kids is we do hard things. So whenever they ask why do we do that? Why are we doing this? Or, you know, why are we doing the difficult thing? The family mantra is simple. We do hard things. And it just becomes normal, right? So that's the culture. Like if you look at this from a leadership point of view, a lot of parents watching this might be running businesses or quite, you know, C-level types who are managing teams. And they know all about developing the culture of an organization or a team when it comes to business. But have they considered the culture of their family's culture? Yeah. A big part of that for me is having a culture of courage at home. I think that courage is the most important skill you can pass on to your child. If you develop your child's courage, their confidence will naturally grow, right? And we all want to give our child confidence, but we try and focus on confidence hacks or things that develop their confidence, when underneath all of that is this foundation layer of developing their courage. And for me, courage isn't just the big one-off scary things like base jumping or professional fighting, whatever it is, right? Standing up and giving a speech or entering their first competition or whatever it is. It's the small things which make the big things in their life. It's having the courage to put their hand up in class so they can learn more. It's having the courage to say no to toxic relationships so they can protect themselves and their boundaries. It's having the courage to believe in themselves and seek more from life. And so if I could leave my kids with one thing, it would be courage, right? It would be the courage to ask more from life, to stand up for themselves and to protect themselves. And I think everything is downstream from that. So that is my fundamental approach when it comes to balancing protection and empowerment and developing the correct family culture for a black belt character in your kids.
And when you gave us the generic example of the mum and the dad, that's the case in our house, but reversed. We won't go there. But we tried to forget this 5 years ago. It seems like yesterday. During the pandemic, you had a personal and professional reckoning. What did that period teach you about success, status, and what fulfills you?
I experienced COVID fairly uniquely, I think, compared to a lot of people, because I was running two businesses in two different countries. When COVID hit in Dubai, my wife was 8 months pregnant. Wow. We had been running the business for a year, and we finally got it to a point where it started to become stable. Then we lost everything within a couple of months. They kicked us out of all of our dojos because we were renting school halls to do this. There were lockdowns, you know, sirens were going off, drones were around looking at people on the streets. You know, there were sirens going off, and when she was about to give birth, so I had to drive through all of that. The roads of Dubai completely empty, and I was bombing it down the streets to try and get to the hospital. You know, all this sort of stuff. Complete uncertainty. And then what followed was the UK going through lockdown, and we lost everything there as well. And so some really key lessons for me stood out. The first thing is I kind of look back with a lot of gratitude because COVID taught me how resourceful and resilient I am as an entrepreneur and creative, right? And so the first thing I did is I really had my mettle tested as an entrepreneur. And I think a lot of people, they've never experienced that in their business growth journey, right? So something like an economic downturn where the economy dips by 20 or 40%. We might experience that in the next few years or 10 years, whatever. And that a typical entrepreneur might look at that and think, that is a disaster. That's the biggest disaster we could ever have. I look at that now and I'm like, that is minor compared to losing everything during COVID while trying to support a family with a wife giving birth in a foreign country. And so, you have these, you can kind of anchor back on moments, and your nervous system now as an entrepreneur is kind of a lot more calm because the anchor I've got of what's the worst case scenario is not even something that a fresh.
Done it. This is a.
They wouldn't even. Do you know what I mean? They wouldn't think about it. And so, if we can survive that, then we can easily survive this, this, and this. And so the first thing I'd say is it gave me huge confidence in my resourcefulness and resilience. What it taught me about being backed into a corner, right? Because when you're backed into a corner, sometimes as an entrepreneur, that's when you're the most creative. And so I was coming up with all these products and ideas and services. And I actually created a 6-figure online business while this was going on with a friend of mine, a social media organization, leveraging loads of video content to create reels when it just started happening. And it was great. And we carried that business on for several years before we sold it on. Whatever you think is the worst case scenario, you can still make it through. And one of the most brilliant habits that it taught me, when I can remember, my heart thinking it's going to explode, just like panic attack. Have you ever been in that position where your heart's just beating through your chest and you just think, how am I going to fix this? I don't know what to do. And so I remember taking a piece of paper. This is something very similar to what the samurai would do or the Vikings would do in a modern context, right? But they would meditate on the worst case scenario. And so I took this piece of paper out. I had a wife who's about to give birth. I've got 2 businesses collapsing around me. I've got no income. How am I even going to pay for the birth? Because that's going to be super expensive in Dubai. So I wrote down everything that could go wrong on this piece of paper, right? This was like Armageddon piece of paper, health, economy, everything. I turned it over and then I wrote down on the back everything I would do if that happened. So I had the worst case scenario and a plan of what to do if that happened. Suddenly, I relaxed, my nervous system relaxed. I took that piece of paper and I put it in a drawer. And then I took a fresh piece of paper and I wrote down what would happen if everything went to plan. What would be the best possible solution here? And the beautiful thing about that is when you're in scarcity mindset, you can't focus on abundance and things going right. So you have to have a process of parking that. And then COVID basically made the Warrior Academy because while everyone was running out of commercial real estate, I decided to run in. Like the building was on fire, everyone was running out. We went in and, got some great deals, got great contracts. And while all of our competitors had basically closed up shop, a lot of them permanently, we launched. And we went from, within 24 months, we were the largest martial arts academy, not just in Dubai, but the Middle East. We had over 1,000 students in one dojo, simply because of our courage in that moment.
It's a common thread and a common theme. We've got 16 or 17 episodes in now, is people's courage, their creativity, their planning for scenarios, but they learn to pivot. That's definitely the key to those who've been successful. I want to finish on some quick fire questions. Just first thing that comes to mind, don't ponder over it at all. One quality every child needs more of today.
Resilience.
One mistake well-meaning parents make too often.
Overprotecting. Rescuing too quickly.
One habit that builds confidence fastest.
Keeping promises to yourself and having a list of evidence where you've been confident and courageous.
One behavior that signals poor character early.
Lack of personal responsibility, blaming other people.
Hope my daughter doesn't watch this. One lesson your accident taught you that still guides you today.
Slow down, but never stop.
And finally, one word that defines a true warrior.
Discipline.
Sebastian, it's been an absolute pleasure. 100 miles an hour, and I suspect your life is always like that and always will be. And that's probably why we align.
Thank you, mate.
Thank you. What stands out for me is that your work doesn't romanticize strength. It grounds it. It shows that confidence, discipline, and resilience aren't about domination or toughness. They're about responsibility, self-awareness, and steady character. And in a world where children are growing up faster, noisier, and more distracted than ever, giving them a framework that builds inner strength might be one of the most important leadership acts any parent can make. Sebastian, thank you for the work you're doing and for joining us on The Power Within.